Yes. We have sheets if anyone wants, pens if anyone wants. So this is officially marked as a 5-part kosher class, although we've been doing so fantastic that we really are going to hopefully finish up tonight because we're just basically done. If there's anything else that anyone wants to add in or has questions about, that would be great. There's only 4 people here right now, so I could just easily have this conversation. But I wanted to, at the end, have Rabbi Klein, who I spoke to, and he volunteered. He's the head of the DK. Getting ahead of myself.
Would you want to come to Kosher Art Kitchen as part of one of the classes?
So that happened to be, he probably could. So that is Rabbi Klein, for all those who don't know him. He was very open to giving a class on anything he wanted. I thought that the most practical class for him to give would be for him to come up and basically say what he does when he comes to Kosher Kitchen, what it would take from you, from him. And I know before he coaches the kitchen, he normally sits down and talks to them about basics of kosher. Basically, have that speech in like a half hour, 45 minutes, which he is open to doing. He's in Israel right now. He's coming back Sunday. Anyways, this Sunday you're out of town. There's a Super Bowl, so this Sunday's off. And we're basically done now. So we could schedule this for any time that's convenient. He's open to it. Everyone wants to pick a date. We could do that.
Yeah, that's good.
And
how about not this Sunday, not the next Sunday, but the next one? Sunday.
That's the 19th, 21st?
Well, we're out of town the next 2 Sundays.
So the next Sunday will be the 21st. That's data trivia night in Plano.
21st isn't great for me because I'm coming, which I don't know what time I'm landing, but I'm going to be in Baltimore that weekend because my sister-in-law's getting married.
February 28th, which will not be the last day of the month. How's that?
Oh, getting fancy here. It's good with me. It's good with everyone else? Yeah. Okay. Easy enough. Only 4 people. I'll confirm with Rabbi Klein. And then, so maybe we'll do it. We can do it in your guys' house if you want. You can walk around the kitchen and show us everything. And I don't know if we'll actually kosher then or not, but at least it'll be convenient for him.
So we need a new dishwasher by February 28th.
If you want to talk to him in advance to see if you could actually do the process of it there, I'm happy to talk to him about it. I don't know how long that takes, if that's not practical for a class like it, because there's a lot of downtime. But if it works, I have no plan for that. No problem with whatever. Okay, so are there any other remaining questions that anyone has? Either ask now or by the end of tonight. Hopefully, we wouldn't have covered it these ways. So blessings are not actually part of kosher. Your food is kosher if you make a blessing on it or not, but when we're talking about food, there's definitely an important aspect, which is, as everyone knows, you say grace before you eat, but it wouldn't be the same if we didn't have a yarmulke on him, right? So now he looks very religious. Also, he's got a white beard. He looks very rabbinic. Quick change of look over there. But so there definitely is a important idea. This is really a topic in and of itself. It's not really part of kosher. But just to make everyone aware, it's an easy thing. It's part of, sanctifying the physical. We sit, we eat, we indulge. We should take a second to recognize it comes from God. We could use this in a holy way. And because of that, this is just 6 different blessings that we make. This is on fruits of the tree. Most wheat products or grain products, wine, grape juice. Let's go the other way. Bread, vegetables, everything else. So 6 base topics. This you could just type into Google if you want. It's on the brachos chart, and you'll find 20 days. But you could also find all these things on apps. We could type in. I forgot chapter 20. Someone showed me once. I put it in and make a bracha. It's very simple. It's literally 10 words basically, and it's a great way to just refocus yourself while eating and not just getting caught in the physical pleasure of it. Once on the topic of blessings, so I'll throw out just an interesting question that they discussed. We've mentioned in the past, somewhat as a recap, between meat and then milk, it's customary to wait 6 hours. So let's say you take a nap, whatever, you wake up, it's 4 hours later, and you take a glass of milk or hot cocoa or coffee, and you totally forget that you're in the middle of waiting 6 hours. So you make the blessing on milk, which is shakol niyeh. I cut off a little bit, but everything should be as you said. And then before you drink it, now when you make the blessing, you're supposed to drink it right away. As soon as you make the blessing, all of a sudden now you realize, wait a second, I can't actually drink this. I'm supposed to be waiting 6 hours till I drink milk. So what do? do you lose the blessing? Because you're not supposed to just, blessings include God's name. We're not supposed to say God's name in vain.
Could you eat or drink something else that wasn't milk in its place?
So you're supposed to, when you make a blessing, really ideally, you're supposed to be holding the item that you're making the blessing on when you're making it. And if there's too much time between, so you could also lose your blessings. That's generally not ideal. So what's the consensus here? Do you drink the milk or do you not?
I'd say not.
Brian says
I
not.
say you do it.
Mark says you go for it.
I say no.
Say no?
I say no.
No. Okay, so we got 3 no's and 1 yes. So it's interesting. If we let's just explain what each of these 2 things are. Waiting 6 hours is a rabbinic decree to separate between milk and meat. And therefore, you're supposed to do it, but the biblical one is only when you're eating milk and meat together. That was cooked together. This is a rabbinical extension to separate milk and meat because there's residue in your mouth and we're concerned with these things, but it's not biblical. But saying God's name in vain is actually a biblical prohibition, one of the 10 commandments, do not say my name in vain. So the rabbis actually speak out that if you're during the 6 hours and you made a blessing on milk, but don't go ahead and make a blessing, but if you already did, you should actually take a sip of that milk because saying God's name in vain is worse than drinking it. Now, on that topic, this brings out a very important point. Let's say you were trying to wait 6 hours, or even if you want to start waiting 1 hour or something, just to, start working on it. So you're waiting whatever time you're waiting, and during that time, you realize that you ate some milk, like either this case, or you just spaced out and took a candy bar and you ate it. So that doesn't really affect what you're doing to somebody. Just because you ate milk one time, we don't say it's broken now, and you could just go eat milk. We say you're supposed to still wait the full, let's say 6 hours, or if you're waiting 3 hours, and whatever it is that you're waiting, you should still continue waiting that much time, even if you've already ate milk, you shouldn't continue to eat that milk. So you should, in this case, you should take 1 sip of milk, put the milk down, and then carry on.
So here's a question on that not taking God's name in vain topic. Can you change the slide?
So you'll notice that I thought of this as I was printing it. If you look at your sheet, it doesn't have God's name on your sheet because, you see that? I edited it out of the sheet. Because I didn't erase it because I think erasing would be forbidden, but I took a little piece of white blankness and covered it up. I don't believe that's called erasing because on the screen they're both there. And then when I printed it, it just didn't print that part because it didn't see it. And on the screen, I'm not getting rid of it. It's just on a different screen. But these papers I were concerned wouldn't get thrown out properly or whatever. So on the papers, I intentionally left them off. But good call. I thought of that after I printed the first time, oh, a second. I just noticed that it was. Anyways, okay, it's good. We thought of that one though. Good call. Another topic we didn't discuss yet is the topic of spicy foods. So spicy food, some people like them. I personally am not a big spicy food guy, but not that cool. But spicy foods have a few unique character traits in terms of kosher. One of them we mentioned in the past that after you don't use a pot for a long time, so the taste doesn't live in it forever. Let's say you cooked pork in your pot. So eventually, that taste of pork would no longer be relevant because it just can't survive in steel forever. If you cook something spicy in that pot, spicy foods have the ability to bring out flavors and re-access the flavor, to make them positive flavor again. So therefore, if you're cooking spicy foods inside of a meat or milk pan, it will make this spicy food. You cook one of these hot peppers, or some other examples, we have some garlics, onions, whatever it would be, that would make your stuff milk. So let's say, for example, you wanted to saute onions and then have it with on your pizza. So if you saute your onions in a fleshik, in a meaty pan, it would be a problem to then put that on your pizza, even if you haven't used this pan in a long time. So that's the spicy food. The second property of spicy foods is that they're an exception to the rule of heat. Generally, things only get transferred, taste only gets transferred with heat. By spicy foods, there's a thing called pressure of a knife, or of a blade. It's not limited to a knife. It's going to be anything that works with blades, a grater, a food processor, a blender, anything that has a blade on it. When a blade cuts through a sharp item, it can absorb the flavor from that blade. So if you have a meat knife or a milk knife, and you cut an onion just with a knife, everything's cold. You just cut the onion with a meat knife, it'll now make this onion a meat onion, which you now should not go ahead and use it with milk. Put it in your, potato, cheese soup, whatever you can do that. You shouldn't do that. as a suggestion, what some people do, because this is a very common thing, say another example of this where it comes up a lot is, let's say you don't want to use the whole onion, so you cut half an onion and use it for whatever you're sauteing it, and then you put the other half of the onion in your fridge, or you want to save it for something else. So now if you cut that initial onion with a flashik, meaty knife, the other half sitting in your fridge, you really shouldn't use with milk. Because of that, some people, when they always just cut sharp foods with a parve knife, they have a parve knife they use for sharp foods. I can't say I always do this. Whenever I do it and I know I'm not gonna use the whole thing, like let's say I'm cutting part of an onion and I'm not gonna use the whole thing, then I'll always cut it with a parve knife. Because you don't want to make the other half milk or meat, put in the fridge, and then you or your spouse, you don't know what it was before, or even you yourself forget what you did with it, and then it's just gonna potentially cause mistakes. That's the other exception of spicy foods, is that it comes out with a knife, which also means that if you have a cheese grate or something like this, and you would grate onions on it, so that could be a problem because it could be dairy, and then that could get transferred into the onions, and same with if you use these for meat or whatever they were used for, if it got taste inside of it, that could potentially be a problem by spicy foods. Another place this could be a problem is if you buy any spicy food that was, like let's say you're buying from Tom Thumb, or from a non-kosher store. So if you're buying watermelon, it's generally not such a big deal, because since watermelon is not spicy, no taste is getting absorbed. Our only concern is if they use a dirty knife. Most vegetable departments have unique knives for the exclusive purpose of cutting watermelons, because they don't want their bacon on their watermelon, just like you don't want it, not for a kosher reason, just because it's not professional, it would ruin their product, and it would make people not happy. So most places have it, and therefore most times you want to buy cut watermelon in Tom Thumb, Whole Foods is generally not going to be a problem. But let's say you're buying diced onions, or you're buying any sharp food or hot peppers, and they were cut up or something like that. So if that doesn't have a proper kosher symbol on it, it could be a problem, because even if they used this knife a long time ago to cut something not kosher, and then they haven't used it in years and they switched it over to the vegetable department, it could be a problem, because that taste, through the pressure of cutting the knife, could itself get into that. So that's why when you're buying spicy foods that are cut, so I'm not sure how common that is. It probably comes up more with watermelon and those types of things. But they do have like diced. That's also like certain spices like diced garlic and stuff. So these things would need a hechsher on it, because you have to know how they did that exactly. This is another additional problem potentially. I've been asked this in the past. What's the problem if you're only buying kosher food in a non-kosher restaurant? So what could be wrong? I know it's just all kosher food, all the ingredients are all kosher. So first of all, we mentioned in the first class, it's very hard to know that all the ingredients are kosher, because even the restaurants themselves don't know what's included in natural flavors, and they themselves don't really know. But let's even say you just say, I'm going to get a salad. So if this salad has onions or purple onions or sharp food items inside of it, so I'm not sure that they have special knives just for vegetables. It could be they use something else that was lying around the kitchen. So that could potentially be a problem, even just getting a salad in a non-kosher establishment. A second problem of a non-kosher establishment, and it's nothing to do with that specifically in general thing, is there's a rabbinical prohibition against eating food cooked by a non-Jew, which is called bishul akum. Bishul means cooking. Akum stands for really idol worshiper, but it's not unique to that. This was instituted specifically. There's a bunch of rules where the rabbis forbade. There's, let's say, food from a non-Jew, wine. We'll get there in a second. That was touched by non-Jew, certain like chalav Yisrael, right? So some of them were out of concerns of mixing in non-kosher food items with it, and certain ones were out of concern of intermarriage. So because of that, there is a prohibition to eat food cooked by non-Jew. Now, this is not talking about every single food item. What's it talking about? So first thing is, it's only foods that are fit to be on a king's table. So nowadays we don't have a king, but let's say on a nobility's table. So for example, let's say you have cereal. So cereal is baked, a lot of them. Most of them probably by non-Jews. And we all eat them. That's not a problem, because that's not what a king would serve at his meal. There was a big question in the Kosher organizations going back. I think this was when George Bush was president. I don't remember exactly who was it. No, I think it was Bill Clinton. And I think Netanyahu was already prime minister there. And he was coming into Washington for a meeting, and they had a meeting Friday night. He was hosting the White House Friday night, so Bill Clinton decided to prepare for him a Shabbos meal Friday night in the White House. Now, Friday night, Shabbos meal in the White House, you have to serve gefilte fish, right? That's the classic Jewish dish. Now, until this point, everyone always assumed that gefilte fish is not considered something that is befitting to put on a nobility's table. It's like a little thing in a package, an Unger's ground fish, like it's not like a fancy food. So everyone would say that's not fit for a king's table. But now, all of a sudden, the president himself serves this to the prime minister, which caused the whole ruckus, because now is this going to now be a problem of bishul akum, right? Because now maybe we can classify this as, most people still said it's not. He just did it for him as a cute gesture. So it's only going to apply to things that are fit for a king's table and things that cannot be eaten raw. Meaning, if something could be eaten raw, so let's say, for example, a carrot. So when you cook a carrot, you're not creating any significant change in the carrot because it was already edible and it's still edible. So it's only things that were originally not edible and now become edible and are fit to be on a king's table. That's where this prohibition would apply. And it could apply, meaning, let's say, potatoes are an interesting example. French fries are generally assumed to not be fit for the king's table, right? French fries are like a fast food item. If you were sitting at the president's table, you wouldn't be noshing on French fries, right? But roasted potatoes,
like a baked potato.
Baked potato, roasted potatoes, that could totally be served on his table. So it's not necessarily based even on the food item, it's based on the dish that's served. And this will change in time. In Russia, I believe, back in the day, no one noble would eat potatoes. Potatoes was like the poor man's food, and no one would be caught eating potatoes if you were a esteemed member of society. In today's world, like baked potatoes, roasted potatoes, totally normal to be served at weddings and fancy events and noble meals. So this would be based on your place of residence, where you're living, and the times you're living in. This, again, would be a problem, though, when you're eating in a non-kosher establishment. Again, if it's officially kosher food, if they're making something for you aside of the flavor that could be in the pots and sharp foods, additionally, you could come across the bishul akum problem of cooked by a non-Jew. Now, if a Jew is involved in the cooking process, that permits this whole problem. The problem is only when a food is exclusively cooked by a non-Jew. So how is a Jew involved in the process? He could turn on the fire, or he could raise the fire, or he could stir the pot, flip it over. Any of these types of involvements of where the Jew is involved as part of the cooking process would be totally fine and not have this problem at all.
I thought it was just supervised.
Right, so that wouldn't work. That's why in like a dairy, let's say, any kosher restaurant, the Jew always turns on the fire. That's part of the mashgiach's job, generally is. When he comes in, he has to turn on the fire, and the workers are supposed to know that if for whatever reason the fire went out, you have to have the mashgiach come and light the fire again. Because if they were light the fire, then that would create a problem when they're serving, even if all the ingredients are kosher, right? You're in a dairy, all the ingredients are kosher, but there's a separate prohibition of foods cooked. The chef in a dairy is not a Jew, and therefore they're careful for that. Moving on, a second.
Do you need other chopsticks?
That's fine.
Be happy to attack the platter,
Okay.
Another rabbinically instituted prohibition is wines that were touched by a non-Jew. Now, this only applies to, see if you can see it here or not. If you read these words, it says kosher Passover and year-round, not mevushal. I don't know if you ever noticed those words before. Mevushal or not mevushal. If you look in the back of any kosher wine, it will always tell you the word mevushal literally means cooked, and not mevushal means not cooked. The prohibition of wines touched by a non-Jew only applies to a bottle of wine that was not cooked. It was never heated above 110 degrees, basically. If you look at this bottle of wine here, I did another one for you. Oh, sorry, that's where it is. Look at this bottle of wine. So see clearly, it says kosher Passover mevushal, which means that it was cooked. So wines that are mevushal, that are cooked, classy wines tend to not be mevushal. If you go to France, they'll and that region where they're very into wines, they'll tell you that when you heat up the wine, it ruins part of the fineness of the flavor. And fancy wines generally tend not to be mevushal. Lower wines often are mevushal. So again, this only applies to wines that are not mevushal, and also only once it's an open bottle of wine. Right? If it's all wine you buy, kosher or not, was transported and moved and shelved and everything by Jews. It only applies to wines that are open and they moved the wine, like they moved the bottle or poured the bottle or something like that. That is a second just important kosher concept. Again, not based on the ingredients of it, but even though there's no problem with ingredients, foods cooked by non-Jew or wines touched by non-Jew can pose kosher problems. The last topic of the kosher series, and we'll have a few minutes on the philosophy of it, is there's certain foods that the Gemara tells us, the Talmud teaches us, and it's codified in the Code of Jewish Law, that even though it's not kosher, it's considered dangerous. Now, one of them we've mentioned in the past, just wanted to bring that again, eating fish and meat together. Fish and meat are generally not served. You'll never see any rabbinically supervised event that will serve at the same time, fish and meat. You'll have a fish course and then a meat course, but we'll never be eating fish and meat together. They'll be careful not to even serve from the same platter. You have to ask if you want fish and meat. They'll always have two sets of tongs to serve it with. They won't let them touch. That is by fish and meat. This is only a problem with actual fish and actual meat. But let's say you want to cook fish in a meaty pot. There's no problem with fish with meat flavor. It's just fish and meat itself. So that is fish and meat. Another halacha, which is an interesting one, is there's a halacha that in the morning, when you wake up, you're supposed to take a cup and rinse your hands. It's called in Hebrew netilas yadayim, washing your hands. The generally accepted way is you take a cup, you fill it up, and you pour one, two, three. Go back and forth 3 times, and then that's called washing your hands in the morning, which is considered part of reawakening yourself spiritually. You rinsing off the whatever is there from the night times, and now you wake up. Officially, you're not supposed to touch food. It's considered dangerous to touch food before you've washed your hands in the morning. So, again, another not directly kosher item, but nice halacha to wash your hands in the morning. If you didn't wash your hands in the morning and you touched the food, the Code of Jewish Law says you should rinse off that food 3 times under a faucet. Okay, that's really the wrap-up of the laws of kosher. I'll talk for a few minutes maybe on philosophy now. Just a little background. You can go on philosophy of kosher for hours and hours and hours. This is just a basic kind of idea to throw out. Before we go to that aspect of it, are there any other questions across the gamut on the laws of kosher? I'm not disappearing, so you can think of them later and email or ask me, whatever also. But
I was thinking, so with the fish and meat, you can serve them as different courses though. Because what came in my head, I feel like it might be Rosh Hashanah, I don't know. But there's one holiday where you have the head of a fish.
Rosh Hashanah, exactly.
Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's okay, as long as it's that first and then the meat after.
Right. Yeah, as long as you have it. And that's why generally you'll find people have, it could be people do this anyways, even when they're not Jewish. They have 2 forks, a fish fork and a regular fork. I don't think that's an inherently Jewish thing. But Jewish people are also very particular on that because you don't want to you clear off the fish plate, and the fish fork, and take those utensils off the table to make sure that now what you're eating meat, you have fresh set of non-fishy stuff. But yeah, a lot of Shabbos meals, people will serve a gefilte fish, like we were saying before.
Yeah.
And then later you're going to have chicken or meat or whatever. So again, if you want to separate between fish and meat, you're supposed to do like we did between milk and meat. You're supposed to eat something and drink something. And if you ate it with your hands, then wash your hands off. Just to clean out your mouth in between. Okay, any other questions on kosher? So whenever you go to philosophy and kosher or Kabbalah or these types of things, it's always the Kabbalists always tell us the way you try to pinpoint the concept of it is to look, where does the Torah first mention this concept? Where does it first come up, and see it in its initial source? Try to figure out from there what the message is. So who here knows what the first concept of dietary restrictions is in the Torah? Kosher.
Would it be from Adam and Eve?
Abraham.
That's what I would,
Adam and Eve.
think, yeah.
Right? It's interesting. We don't think of that in the context. We think of kosher, chapter 11 in Leviticus, talks with different animals and stuff. But if you think about it, God created the world. He put Adam and Eve. Oh, I forgot about this part of it.
That's awesome.
And again. 1 second. There he is. It's hard to get the right angle. He had a very awkward shaped head, you know?
God,
It was hard to... We worked it out. It's a little bit like this. What's that?
Would Hashem be the young?
Would Hashem need a yarmulke? I mean, he says we should be like him, right? So
There you go.
I thought it was to show respect.
So this is, the word yarmulke. You know the word yarmulke? I think it's a Yiddish word, yarmulke. English it's like a beanie cap, in Hebrew it's a kippah. I think yarmulke is a Yiddish word. It actually comes from the word yare malka. Yare is the word fear. Malka is the word melech, king, fear of the king. Which part of the concept of yarmulke is supposed to remind you, not like fear of God, not like greed, but to remind you, God's around. Don't forget, it's like a constant reminder that there's something on top of you, greater than you, a God up there. It's kind of like a reminder on your head. That's nothing to do with kosher, except that God wears yarmulke evidently. But the first place we do find the concept of kosher is in the Garden of Eden. It is impossible to find an appropriate picture of the Garden of Eden. They all have
That's really good though.
Adam and Eve are just. I guess they weren't clothed in the Garden of Eden. So, anyways, here's a nice picture.
Yeah.
It could be the Garden of Eden. I couldn't tell what tree this is because there's a bunch of different stuff going on. But
it's a mystery tree.
It's a mystery tree, exactly. So we find that the source of kosher really is in the Garden of Eden, right? God creates man and woman and puts them in this paradise existence, and he gives them only one commandment. Tells them one thing to do, and this one thing he tells them is dietary restrictions, right? That wasn't don't eat pork, it wasn't, don't eat milk and meat together, but he said you can eat from all of the trees of the garden, and from this one tree, don't eat from this one tree, right? So it's interesting to know, why is it that, and then we all know what happened there. They messed up on that, they didn't keep kosher, and then all of a sudden that changed the face of the world forever. So what exactly is it about kosher, about dietary restrictions that are so important for us? So the main, a fundamental principle in Judaism is that the reason the world was created is actually not for us to go crazy and get frustrated and be upset. It was created for us to seek pleasure. We're supposed to get pleasure from this world. Now, it's a basic principle of pleasure that if you overindulge in pleasure, you ruin that pleasure for yourself. This is not a Jewish concept. This is a concept in general. You can find this across the world. But when you have rules and guidelines to how you indulge in pleasures, that allows you to properly harness and take out those pleasures properly. Let's just take a simple example. Everyone here is married. So you're married, right? So that means you're obligated to have rules and restrictions on who you're allowed to do certain activities with, right? We have to be trustworthy and faithful to our spouses. And let's just say, well, I want to have the most pleasure, so we could just throw that out and you could just be with anyone you want, right? It's not just that that's unfaithful and wrong. It's more than that. It actually doesn't allow you to properly harness the potential pleasure you can get from your relationship. Or part of developing a relationship between two people is that deep connection that you can create through being together and developing your relationship together. When you're just out getting all the pleasures in the world, so I guess in one perspective, maybe you view yourself as getting more pleasures, although I think you'll get bored of those pleasures and they won't really intrigue you for so long. But when you can have certain rules and limitations to a certain extent allow you to develop the pleasures that are supposed to exist in a greater way. Kosher is the same thing. If all we did was that movie Supersized, is that called Supersized? Is that what it's called?
Supersize Me.
Supersize Me. So all he did was he just ate a supersized McDonald's meal every single day, and he just indulged. The obvious message when you overindulge with no guidelines, it's not just that it's unhealthy and it's not good for you and you're not productive through that. It's more. It's also the fact that you become numb to the actual pleasure of the item itself. So a basic aspect of kosher, and why here? So eating, I believe, more than any of the other pleasures of the world, eating is probably the most basic physical pleasure that human beings have. We start doing it the first day we're born, and we don't stop until we die. No? I mean, it's the most basic, continuous pleasure. I don't know of any other pleasure like that. You can enjoy sights, you can enjoy music, there's a lot of pleasures we can have in the world. The only pleasure that we really do basically consistently from the time we're born until the time we die is eat. So I think eating is probably the most basic concept of physical pleasure. And I think this is perhaps the message that God was giving Adam and Eve, I'm creating this whole world for you to get pleasure from it, you have to recognize that part of getting proper pleasure from that is that there has to be certain guidelines and certain rules to properly benefit from it. It's like you find like the same thing with like, I guess in a different type of example with like drugs, right? If you start taking hard drugs, so you do a little bit and it like works for you, then you have to do that same amount and all of a sudden you don't get pleasure from it anymore, right? And then you have to go to more, then you have to go to more, and you have to go to more until you kill yourself from it, and you think I'm seeking pleasure because it feels so good, but you're just not able to find true pleasure, and you're just making it harder and harder and harder for yourself to actually get that pleasure. I'm going to read to you a quote from Rabbi Emanuel Feldman because I thought it was an awesome quote, even though I generally hate reading during classes because I find it boring. So I'm going to do it anyways because I can't say it as well as him, but bear with me, it's only a few lines. If we want our world to be a Garden of Eden, we must learn discipline and self-control, which means being able to say no to the impulse to take a bite out of the appealing, delightful, tempting, but forbidden fruit. Paradise begins with the ability to say no to the self, right? Meaning the ability for man to perfect himself and to become greater really comes down to self-control in a certain extent. And food being the most basic form of physical indulgence really, I think, is why kosher is such a basic concept in Judaism. Judaism also talks about the concept, there's a classic distinction between, say, Catholicism and Judaism. So there's a great debate. Catholicism or the religions that view abstinence as an ideal. What's that concept? That concept is that they can't reconcile physical pleasures with spiritual growth. They exist on two different planes. You can either be physical or you can be spiritual. So if we want to truly be spiritual, we have to separate ourselves from the physical. Judaism very strongly disagrees with that approach. Judaism is a very pleasure-oriented philosophy, but again, it's pleasure with rules and guidelines to properly harness that pleasure. So since part of the concept of physicality is to be able to uplift it and raise it up, like we mentioned before, the concept of blessings, so kosher is probably the most basic, against a basic physical pleasure, that through this we're able to recognize that we're able to take just a physical action, it's just enjoyable and everyone just does it, and actually make something spiritual out of it. We could take something basic and a basic physical need and say, this isn't just a physical action, this is something that I can make myself more godly through doing this. I can actually add spirituality into it. I think that's probably the most basic, simple understanding of kosher, that it teaches you self-discipline and self-restraint and how to maximize yourself. And I've heard from my rabbis before, from his name is Rabbi Leichter, he said it in the name of Rabbi Wolbe, who was like the leading Musar rabbi, the leading rabbi of character development. Remember, he said that if you want to work on any aspect of life, of overcoming desire, it can be in any aspect. If you love playing video games, or you love whatever it is, you struggle because you just love doing this thing, and you can't stop yourself. He said the place to start working on yourself is the kitchen. It's a very interesting thing. He said that our most physical action that we're constantly doing is food, and when our relationship with that is just not thought of, and we just eat and we don't even think about it, that manifests itself out through all the other aspects of life that we then find it hard to control in other aspects, which I just thought was very interesting type of, I wouldn't have thought like that, but he was saying no matter what aspect of character development you're working on, even just working with food, it's not overindulging and just eating properly, kosher definitely being a part of that is a start of that. But I think it goes much deeper than that, and we'll speak out another concept of this. And that is, when Adam and Eve were created. So, like we mentioned before, the verse describes that they were naked in the Garden of Eden. Now, if you look in the sources describe that they weren't clothed, but they didn't have the same physical body that we have nowadays. The Torah describes that when God put them in the Garden of Eden, they were basically spiritual beings that wore their bodies like we wear our pajamas. Like they were these, and they had shining through their bodies was this like emanating light of spirituality that they kind of like, it wasn't like the pictures that we would see nowadays. When you imagine it, it was like there's a light, and then when they ate from this tree of knowledge that kind of contaminated them, that tainted it, and that made them become clothed up and like change their physical self and change the world around them. So putting that aside for a second, we see from this something very interesting. Even when they were in that high spiritual state, what were they commanded? Dietary laws. Right? They were still commanded only one thing, and that is they could eat from everything, but don't eat from this one tree. So we see that even the spiritual side of us has food affects it. We could just bring this out simply. How would we define death?
Like just your organs failing and life functioning stopping.
Organs failing, life functioning stopping.
Your body stops.
Your body stops.
Absence of life.
Absence of life. Okay, these are all great answers. This is all true. What would I say that's an effect of? The soul departing the body. Right? The body is a union of spiritual and physical. The physical body with a spiritual soul inside of it, and that soul is the life source of the body. And when that soul departs, then your body is just left on its own and can't continue like that. That is the Jewish view of death. So, given that is a fascinating thing, let's say we decide to stop eating. So what will happen to us?
We'll die.
We'll die. Which means that if we don't stop eating and we stay alive, somehow through our eating, it's not only nourishing our physical bodies, but it's sustaining that soul inside of us, and it's also allowing that soul to continue to live and to continue to thrive. Which means that when we eat our food sustains not only our body, but also our soul. And just like we know with food, if all you eat is cholesterol, so it'll clog your arteries and kill you, and he takes this in a lot of different examples, that same applies in terms of your spiritual nourishment you're getting. There are certain foods that are spiritual cloggers, so to speak. Just like there's physical things, since the food is sustaining both body and soul, so the food you eat has to be healthily, whatever the word is, digestible by both body and soul. And that's where kosher really comes in, when the Torah describes to us exactly how to do that. In that sense, that's a good slide.
I like that.
So in that same way, there's another interesting slide that I'll put here afterwards. You are what you eat. Every 28 days, your skin replaces itself. Some slides said 35 days. You could ask the doctor which one it is. Your liver 5 months, your bones 10 years. Your body makes these new cells from the food you eat. What you eat literally becomes you. Right? Meaning what? So this was not taken from a Jewish website. This is taken from an Eat Healthy website. But the message is clear. And this is I think probably a very basic idea in Judaism also. I'll bring it out with a fascinating question. Anyone here heard of the Chafetz Chaim? Rabbi Yisrael Radin. He was like the greatest Torah leader. Probably died, I think, in the 1920s, after between World War I and World War II, maybe. So in the early 1900s. And he has a specific book called Machane Yisrael, which is questions for Jews that were drafted into the Polish army. And he published a book for people who were taken by force into the Polish army, how to be properly as a Jew, live properly as a Jew in the Polish army. Someone asked him the following question. He said, I was drafted into the Polish army, I have no choice, I have to go. But I do have two choices of camps to go to. I can either go to the camp in which I'll be able to keep Shabbos at this camp, Shabbos being very important, but they will not be able to give me kosher food there. So I'll be able to keep the Shabbos, but I'll have to eat not kosher food. Or I could choose another camp in which I'll be allowed to keep kosher food, but I'm going to have to be working and doing stuff on Shabbos, and I won't be able to keep the Shabbos. So he asked the Chafetz Chaim, this great Torah leader of the early 1900s, said, I'm getting drafted to the Polish army, which camp do I go to? That was his question. Hard question. What do you say?
I have a feeling because this is a kosher class, the answer is kosher.
You're probably right.
Speaking of my context, like that. What were you going to say?
But Shabbos would make sense to me too, though.
Why would Shabbos make sense?
Because it's one of the most important things is to keep the Shabbos as well.
Shabbos is one of the most important mitzvahs, that's for sure.
So we were discussing during an earlier class that you can't say which mitzvah is more important.
Well, here's a real life question. You got to go to one of the camps. I can't tell you which is more important, but I have to answer the question.
I'll say if you don't eat, you die.
so you have to eat. You may as well eat kosher stuff.
But if you
nourish your soul and stuff.
okay,
But
I hear.
keeping the Shabbos is one of the big Ten Commandments. You know.
Shabbos, one of the 10 Commandments, doesn't say explicitly kosher anywhere in the 10 Commandments. Like it. So he said a very interesting thing. There's a law in Judaism that you're never held accountable for something you're forced to do. Right? If somebody holds a gun to your head and says, except for the 3 cardinal sins, says eat pork, says talk negatively about your friend, says any prohibition of the Torah, right? You are obligated to do that and not die because you need to keep yourself alive. That's a basic principle in Judaism. And when you do that action, let's say you ate that pork, you're not held accountable for that. You needed to do that. So you're not held accountable for that. So says the Chafetz Chaim, either camp, when you go, you're going to be forced to do whichever prohibition it's going to be. If you're doing Shabbos, you're not held accountable for breaking Shabbos, being forced to break the Shabbos. You don't want to. If you're eating not kosher, you don't want to be eating not kosher, you're being forced to. Therefore, in terms of a purely which one's better, which one's worse,
They're even.
they're really even because you're not held accountable for either one. Never you can call it even. That being said, says the Chafetz Chaim, you should go to the one where you can keep kosher. Good inference, Mark over there. It's a kosher class. You should go to where you can keep kosher. Why? Because even though you're not held accountable for it, what you eat literally becomes part of you. Right? When we eat food, it affects us. And what we eat and the nature of the foods that we eat, when they get broken down in our bodies, that becomes a part of our, in this sense, physical selves. But also just what goes into our bloodstreams and stuff, it can affect us. I quoted, I think it was at your house, there's an interesting response from Maimonides where there were a group of heretics that wrote a question to Maimonides saying, God doesn't really exist, and what are you guys talking about, and Torah is made up, and all of these kinds of concepts. And Maimonides had to write back to them. So he didn't even want to write back to them. He was upset at them. He told his student, Rabbi Ibn Tibin is his name, and it's an Arabic name. And this is what he told him to write back to them. He told him to write back to them, and Maimonides himself was a doctor, and he explains, I don't even really understand all the words he uses because it's like based on medical terminology of his time. But what he basically explains is the process of how food gets broken down in your body. Now, when you chew it and you swallow it, and the different parts of your body break it down, and it goes from that part to the liver, to the kidney, to the, all the different parts of your body, and after it gets refined, part of that goes back up to your brain. And based on what you eat, that actually affects how you're going to be thinking at the end of the day. And I see from the questions you're asking, you must not be keeping kosher. Because you wouldn't even be asking these questions if you were thinking clearly. But I can't respond to your questions because you've created yourself to be in a situation where you're not going to probably understand them. So, in a very real way, what you eat affects you. It's interesting. There's a lot of kind of different reasons. Like, for example, chewing your cud and having split hooves. So, why is that? So, first of all, every animal that has split hooves is not an attacking animal. They're all vegetarian. They don't kill other animals. All animals that kill animals have claws. That's how they kill them and tear them apart. If you have hooves, you can't really do much with them. So, we're part of one of the concepts is that they explain is that we don't want to be eating animals that are attackers. It kind of creates a angry kind of essence inside of you. Another concept of chewing your cud, one of the ideas about chewing your cud, is that chewing your cud expresses happiness with your lot. You're not always going out, running around, seeking more pleasure. You have the food, you eat the same food again. Your wife may do the same thing for dinner again, eat it again. You have oatmeal, eat it again. It's fine. We're content. That's represented with chewing your cud. So we find that you can go through. There's a lot of reasons for all the different stuff. They say that fins and scales allow a fish to swim upstream by salmon. The way they explain it is because the scales allow them to push off the water in some way, able to swim upstream. People suggest that that's why Judaism. This isn't why, but this is an idea that we can bring out from it. That in Judaism, if you want to really be do what God wants, sometimes it requires you to swim against the stream and to go against the current of what everyone in society is doing. And when we eat these things, this is purified foods that then become part of us, and we develop these character traits inside of us. As opposed to when we eat birds of prey, animals that are attacking, and these types of things, that can, maybe not like the second you eat it, it turns into you, but that allows you, that creates in you these negative traits. And a very interesting last point, will just say that the word used in the Torah for the word used in the Torah for non-kosher animals is tameh. Tameh is an often very mistranslated word. It says animals that are tameh to you shouldn't eat. What does the word tameh literally mean? So it's normally quoted as meaning ritually impure or contaminated or something like that. The word tameh actually comes from the word to mean closed up. If something is akum, something is sealed, something is closed up. So we mentioned, going back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve started as a spiritual being that had like their soul shining through them. They were the spiritual being. When they ate from that forbidden fruit, what that did was that sealed up their light. That made it harder for that soul inside of them to express itself outward. And part of the Torah is teaching us, by using this phraseology of kosher, of an animal that is tameh, it's teaching you that when you eat these foods, since it's spiritually unhealthy, doesn't nourish your soul properly, it blocks up your light of your soul trying to shine through your body. I think that's a basic introduction to kosher. There's 2 books I would recommend. I'll send them an email. I'm going to send an email. Today I found another book in data that I liked. Looks like a cool book. For a very introductory book. There's, I don't have it here, but it's called Kosher for the Curious? Kosher for the Confused and Curious, something like that. I'll send out the link afterwards if you want it. That was a book that seemed very much basically just like what is kosher at a very, very basic level, why we do kosher, how we do kosher, myths about kosher, facts about kosher. Much more like, seemed like a light reading overview book, as opposed to the other book I mentioned, which is a much more technical halacha book. Okay, fantastic. So that wraps up today. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. So then I'll talk to Rabbi Klein, I guess, and we'll work out February 28th, which is not the last day in February.
You get a bonus